The Municipal Archive was a structure of concrete and steel, an industrial mausoleum for forgotten data. Within its cavernous interior, Blake navigated the labyrinthine aisles with the practiced efficiency of a cartographer charting a familiar world. Each morning, the ritual commenced identically: the clatter of the security door, the crisp bite of the unheated air, the precise activation of workstation lamps. Blake's domain was an ordered universe of classified documents, microfiche, and anachronistic objects, each meticulously logged, preserved, and filed. Today's assignment involved the consolidation of Section 7B, a long-neglected quadrant rumored to contain the detritus of a defunct civic planning department from the early 20th century. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that pierced a high window, illuminating the fine particulate layer covering every surface. Blake donned a particulate mask, a standard precaution, and began the systematic process of inventory. Box after box, crate after crate, Blake worked through the accumulated history, their gloved hands sorting through faded blueprints, brittle ledgers, and rusted office supplies. Each item received a temporary tag, a quick assessment, and placement into a designated holding container. The work was monotonous, demanding absolute focus on detail, a quality Blake possessed in abundance. Hours bled into a seamless continuum of methodical action. The rhythmic rustle of paper, the soft thud of a box being moved, the almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system, these were the only sounds in the vast space. Blake felt a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to chaos, in categorizing the forgotten. It was in a particularly decrepit wooden crate, tucked away beneath a stack of water-stained geological surveys, that the anomaly presented itself. The crate was unmarked, its lid jammed shut with a single, corroded nail. Blake retrieved a pry bar from their utility belt and carefully worked the lid open, mindful of splinters. Inside, nestled amongst yellowed newspaper clippings and a handful of petrified rubber bands, lay a small, dark object. It was not a document. It was not a tool. It was a block of what appeared to be carved wood, approximately 10 centimeters square, with a texture like petrified moss. Its surface was uniformly black, absorbing the workstation light without reflection. Blake picked it up. The weight was disproportionate to its size, heavier than any wood Blake had ever handled, possessing the dense inertia of a lead ingot. Blake turned it over in their gloved hand. The carving was intricate, a series of interlocking geometric patterns that seemed to shift subtly under direct scrutiny, never quite resolving into a recognizable motif. There were no discernible seams, no visible tool marks, only this impossibly smooth, yet textured, surface. A faint tremor registered in Blake's hand, a sensation they attributed to the awkward weight distribution or prolonged manual labor. Blake examined the object for any inscription, any identifying mark. There was none. It simply was. This absence of origin, of purpose, was the first deviation from the archive's strict protocols. Every item had a context, a history, even if unknown. This object felt unmoored. Blake placed the block on the clean surface of the processing table, next to the temporary tag dispenser. The blackness of the object seemed to deepen, drawing in the ambient light. Blake experienced a momentary disorientation, a fleeting impression that the corners of the vast warehouse had subtly broadened, stretching beyond their expected dimensions. The feeling passed quickly, dismissed as an optical illusion caused by eye strain. Yet, a cold thread of unease began to spool in Blake's chest, thin but persistent. Blake attempted to photograph the object for the digital inventory. The camera's autofocus struggled, humming an unfamiliar note before finally locking on. When Blake reviewed the image, the patterns on the block appeared less defined than they had in person, almost blurred at the edges, as if resisting capture. Blake tried again, adjusting the lighting, altering the angle. The result was identical. The object's image on the screen lacked the unsettling depth Blake perceived with their naked eye. This was illogical. Digital capture should flatten, not obscure. A low thrum resonated through the floor, a vibration Blake had never noticed before, distinct from the building's usual mechanical drone. Blake paused, listening. The sound was not external, it seemed to originate from within the concrete slab, a deep, almost sub-audible pulse. Blake attributed it to the old building's settling, or perhaps a distant train, though no rail lines ran close to the archive. Still, the persistent thrum contributed to a growing sense of disquiet. Blake consulted the archive's comprehensive digital index, inputting keywords: carved block, unknown origin, geometric patterns. The search yielded nothing. Blake cross-referenced the former planning department's inventory logs, even those marked miscellaneous. The object remained undocumented. It was as if it had simply appeared. A faint metallic taste developed on Blake's tongue, sharp and unexpected. Blake ran their tongue over their teeth, an involuntary action. Blake's gaze drifted from the enigmatic block to the high window, where the gray afternoon light filtered in. Beyond the glass, the landscape was dominated by the vast, unyielding expanse of the frozen lake. Its surface, usually a testament to the stoic indifference of winter, now seemed to possess a different quality. The ice, a uniform sheet of dull white, appeared to ripple at its farthest edges, a subtle distortion Blake knew was impossible. The air above the lake shimmered, not with heat haze, but with an almost invisible, vibrating current. For a meticulous archivist whose life was defined by order and classification, the undocumented, the unexplainable, was a profound breach. Blake looked back at the black block on the table. Its presence, previously merely an anomaly, now felt like an intrusion. The precise lines of Blake's world, once so clearly defined, had begun to waver. Blake's hands, usually precise, trembled slightly as they carefully placed the carved stone artifact on the archive's worn oak table. The Municipal Archive, a fortress of concrete and forgotten histories, hummed with the low thrum of ventilation systems, a constant mechanical breath. For 3 days, Blake had submerged themselves in the artifact's orbit, sifting through adjacent storage units, cross-referencing catalog numbers, and pulling any document remotely connected to the peculiar object's acquisition date or provenance. The initial findings were fragmented, almost meaningless to an untrained eye. A requisition form from a defunct geological survey in 1957, listing unclassified mineral specimen. A shipping manifest from a coastal town. Angular symbols, each resembling a distorted, skeletal hand. Blake's breath hitched. One of the symbols was etched into the surface of the artifact itself, almost imperceptibly, as if worn by centuries of unseen friction. They spent the next several hours meticulously comparing the symbols, their eyes tracing the jagged lines and sharp angles. The repetition was undeniable. These symbols appeared in a surprising number of disparate documents, marginalia in an obscure historical text about local land disputes, a faded photograph of a crumbling stone marker near a long-abandoned quarry, even as a faint watermark on an old map of the region's waterways. Each instance was dismissed or unremarked upon by the original catalogers, filed away as anomalies. But to Blake, they were threads, weaving a pattern of unsettling consistency. A colleague, a younger archivist named Morgan, paused by Blake's workstation, a stack of freshly scanned microfiches balanced on their arm. "Still at it, Blake? You look like you've been wrestling with a ghost." Blake merely grunted, not looking up. "Just connecting some dots." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Dots from what?" "That rock you found? You've been staring at it for days. This is more important." The words came out sharper than intended. Morgan shrugged, a flicker of concern in their eyes, and moved on, leaving Blake to the oppressive silence of their self-imposed vigil. Blake knew they were neglecting their duties, but the artifact exerted a strange, undeniable pull. It felt less like an object of study and more like an entity demanding attention. The psychological impact began subtly. A fleeting shadow in the peripheral vision that vanished when Blake turned their head. The archive's usual hum would sometimes morph into a low, almost guttural thrum, just at the edge of hearing, like a distant, massive engine. Blake dismissed these as fatigue, the strain of long hours and intense focus. Blake found themselves double-checking locked doors, casting nervous glances into the deeper, unlit aisles, an irrational conviction forming that something was watching from the forgotten corners. Late that evening, a specific detail materialized from the deluge of information. Blake identified the area, a vast, desolate body of water now known as the Frozen Lake. The same angular symbols from the artifact and the historical documents were crudely sketched beside the entry. The determination solidified into a desperate need to verify. They had to see it. They had to know. The idea of leaving the archive, of venturing into the biting winter air, normally would have been unthinkable at such an hour. But the artifact had shifted their priorities, blurred the lines between sanity and obsession. The drive was long, the road slick with a thin sheen of black ice. The landscape outside the city limits became increasingly barren, trees skeletal against the bruised twilight sky. Blake gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt a monotonous counterpoint to the escalating tension in their chest. The internal dialogue was a frantic attempt at rationalization. It's just a lake. Just ice. Finally, the vehicle crunched to a halt on a deserted dirt track. Before them stretched the frozen lake, an immense, flat expanse of white under a sky the color of slate. Blake stepped onto the ice, each crunch of their boots echoing unnervingly in the vast stillness. Then, they saw it. Not immediately obvious, but once spotted, impossible to unsee. Carved into the thick, opaque ice near what appeared to be a cluster of ancient, snow-dusted boulders, were the symbols. Not just one, but a series of them, meticulously etched, their lines sharp and deep despite the apparent age. The same angular, skeletal hand, repeated, diminishing in size as they led towards the center of the lake. They seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence in the failing light, an optical trick of the ice, perhaps, but one that made Blake's stomach clench. A sudden, sharp crack echoed across the lake, making Blake jump. It was just the ice shifting, a natural occurrence, but in that moment, it sounded like a colossal bone snapping. Blake's vision blurred at the edges, the world tilting precariously. They pressed a gloved hand against their temple, a dull ache throbbing behind their eyes. Blake closed their eyes, trying to dispel the auditory hallucination, the growing conviction that they were not alone. The ice under their feet felt impossibly thin, the vast, dark water beneath calling to them with a silent, terrible invitation. They opened their eyes, the symbols on the ice seeming to mock their fragile grasp on reality. They were here. The connections were real. Blake remained at the archive table, the artifact a cold, silent anchor in the oppressive stillness. The last echo of Morgan's footsteps had long since faded, leaving Blake in an isolation that felt both chosen and enforced. Hours bled into one another. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost imperceptible frequency that grated on Blake's nerves, or perhaps it was the artifact itself, radiating a subtle dissonance. Blake traced the intricate, non-Euclidean patterns on its surface, the material smooth yet somehow resistant to the touch, like ancient, petrified thought. A faint, almost internal vibration began. It resonated not in the air, but directly behind Blake's eyes, a low thrum that intensified with each passing minute. The edges of Blake's vision softened, the stark lines of the archive shelves wavering. Blake blinked, rubbed their temples. No, the tremor was real. It felt like the entire building, the entire world, was a tuning fork struck by an unseen mallet. Blake pulled a digital recorder closer, muttering observations into the microphone, the sound of their own voice a fragile barrier against the encroaching strangeness. The object. It's not simply inert. It's radiating something. A frequency. Or perhaps it's absorbing a frequency from me. My perception is altered. They paused, listening to the playback, the words sounding alien, distorted, as if spoken through a deep, waterlogged well. Blake deleted the recording. It was useless. The objective tools failed to capture the subjective shift. The compulsion grew. It was not a thought, not a directive, but an insistent, growing pressure behind the eyes, a silent summons. A specific image formed in Blake's mind, unbidden, a vast expanse of white, cracked by dark fissures, reflecting a sky the color of bruised plums. The image was vivid, undeniable. The frozen lake. Blake had visited it once, years ago, on a research trip for a regional geological survey, a place of stark, beautiful desolation. Why now? Why this place? Blake rose, leaving the artifact on the table, an act that felt like abandoning a limb. They needed air, space, the vastness of the image that had implanted itself. The journey was a blur of calculated movements, each step deliberate, yet driven by an impulse Blake could not articulate. The city streets, usually a cacophony, seemed muted, the faces of passers-by indistinct blurs. The world had become a backdrop, a poorly rendered stage set for an unknown drama. The frozen lake stretched before them, exactly as the vision had depicted. A massive, flat expanse of crystalline white, fractured by deep, jagged cracks that snaked across its surface like the veins of an ancient, petrified creature. The sky was indeed a deep, bruised purple, heavy with unspoken storm. Blake walked onto the ice, the crunch of their boots startling in the profound quiet. The surface was treacherous, slick in places, rough in others where the wind had scoured away the snow. They moved towards the center, drawn by an invisible thread, a point where the fissures converged into a complex, spider-webbed pattern. It was here, standing on the vast, groaning surface, that the world truly began to unravel. The vibration returned, amplified, shaking not just Blake's vision, but the very ground beneath their feet. The ice groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through Blake's bones. But it wasn't just the ice. Blake saw the patterns on the artifact, replicated in the cracks of the ice, in the spiraling clouds above, in the frost coating their eyelashes. Everything was connected, everything was a reflection. Then, the world tilted. Not physically, but perceptually. The horizon line warped, bending inward, then outward, as if the entire landscape was breathing, a colossal, slow inhalation and exhalation. The bruised sky pulsed. Blake felt their eyes strain, trying to reconcile what they saw with what they knew to be true. The vastness of the frozen lake became infinite, stretching beyond the curvature of the earth, beyond the visible spectrum. A sound, not heard but felt, resonated from the depths of the ice. It was a pressure, a vast, silent roar that pressed against Blake's skull, threatening to collapse the very architecture of their thoughts. The cracks in the ice began to glow, a faint, sickly green light emanating from their depths, tracing the intricate patterns. And within those patterns, for a terrifying, crystalline moment, Blake saw it. Not a creature, not a form, but a concept. A vast, indifferent consciousness that existed in the spaces between things, in the logical inconsistencies, in the gaps of human understanding. It was the negative space, the absence that defined presence. It had no eyes, no mouth, no limbs, yet Blake felt utterly observed, utterly insignificant. The artifact was not a key, but a lens, focusing this raw, unadulterated reality directly into Blake's mind. The frozen lake was not simply a frozen body of water. The world, Blake realized with a horrifying clarity, was not solid. It was a fragile illusion, constantly maintained, and the artifact had simply shown Blake the seam. Blake fell to their knees, not from pain, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the revelation. The green light pulsed, the ice groaned, and the world continued its slow, silent breathing. Blake looked at their hands, at the familiar lines of their palms, and understood that even these were temporary, arbitrary constructs in a reality far more vast and terrifying than they had ever dared to imagine. The horror was not coming, it had always been here, woven into the very fabric of existence, and now, Blake saw it. The fluorescent lights in the archive had long ceased to hum, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very air. Blake sat, an anchor in a sea of forgotten paper, the artifact cold and still on the table before them. Hours had not bled into one another, they had simply ceased to exist. Time, like a frayed rope, had snapped, leaving Blake adrift in an eternal present, tethered only to the object. Their fingers traced the artifact's intricate, non-Euclidean angles, feeling the cool, smooth surface that somehow felt rough to the mind. Blake's own reflection and the polished wood of the table seemed to shift, the features blurring, reforming, not quite theirs. A stranger peered back, or perhaps, no one at all. A thought, a shard of icy clarity, pierced the haze. This isn't me. The realization was not one of fear, but of profound, unsettling detachment. Blake's memories, once neatly catalogued, now felt like borrowed fragments, disparate and unconnected to any central core. Who was Blake? A name, a collection of habits, a transient form. The compulsion to move arrived not as a conscious decision, but as an irresistible current. It flowed from the artifact, through Blake's fingertips, and into the very sinews of their being. A destination, not named but felt, pulled them. Blake rose, stiff and unburdened by any past or future, a puppet on invisible strings. The archive's exit, a heavy, steel-reinforced door, opened silently before them, an impossible feat. The city outside was a blurred canvas of muted light and indistinct sound, its bustling life a distant, irrelevant hum. The journey was a dream, or perhaps, the dream was the journey. The world was shedding its familiar skin, revealing an older, more primal layer beneath. The wind, a biting, relentless force, swept across it, carrying with it the scent of frozen earth and ancient water. Blake stood at the edge of the frozen lake. It stretched out, an enormous, unbroken sheet of ice, reflecting the pale, indifferent sky. Cracks spiderwebbed across its surface, like veins on an aged hand, hinting at the immense, silent pressures beneath. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a stark, desolate beauty that resonated with the emptiness growing inside Blake. Here, at the periphery of the known world, the last vestiges of their former self crumbled away. It was Blake. It was the absolute, undeniable truth of their own dissolution, the realization that identity was a fragile construct, a momentary ripple in an ocean of unimaginable vastness. The artifact, now held aloft, seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency that echoed in the very marrow of Blake's bones. They stepped onto the ice. Each crunch underfoot was a punctuation mark in the final sentence of Blake's sanity. The frozen lake was a mirror, reflecting not Blake's face, but the infinite, indifferent cosmos that had always been there, just beyond the veil of human understanding. The world. Around them shimmered, not with light, but with an overwhelming presence that Blake could not name, only feel. It was not malevolent, not benevolent, simply is. And Blake, the archivist, the individual, was merely a single, fleeting thought in its boundless, horrifying consciousness. The lines between Blake and the lake, between the ice and the sky, between existence and non-existence, blurred into a single, terrifying truth. Blake was no longer Blake. They were merely an extension, a single, shivering nerve ending of something ancient and vast, poised on the brink of an ultimate surrender. The silence in the archive had been absolute, a vacuum that swallowed not just sound but the very concept of time. Blake had sat, the artifact cool beneath their fingers, watching the dust motes dance in the non-light. Then, without transition, without a blink or a breath, the air bit with a profound, bone-deep cold. Their eyes, slow to focus, registered not the familiar stacks of forgotten records, but a vast, unbroken expanse of white. The wind, a living thing, scoured Blake's exposed skin, stealing warmth, stealing breath. They stood, somehow, on a surface that stretched to an indistinguishable horizon, a flat, gleaming sheet reflecting a sky the color of bruised slate. The artifact was still in their hand, a shard of impenetrable blackness against the stark white of the frozen lake. A profound disorientation settled over Blake, not just of place, but of self. Was this a dream? A hallucination born of sleep deprivation and the artifact's insidious influence? Blake shivered, a reflex that felt alien, as if their body was performing an action it no longer understood. Blake looked down. The ice beneath their feet was a canvas of trapped motion, 1,000 fissures branching like frozen lightning. It was not a shape, not an object, but an absence, a gravitational pull on the light, on the very air. This was it. The culmination. The final, inescapable truth. They took a step, then another, drawn forward by an invisible current. The frozen lake stretched out, an infinite mirror reflecting an infinite, empty sky. Blake's breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a fragile, temporary cloud in the face of such permanence. The artifact hummed now, a low, resonant thrumming that Blake felt not in their hand, but in their very bones, vibrating through their marrow. It was not a sound, but a resonance, a frequency that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the core of their being. As Blake moved deeper onto the lake, the ice began to change. Not cracking, not shifting, but revealing. They were intricate, geometric, yet utterly alien, like the skeletal framework of a non-Euclidean geometry. Blake understood, with a clarity that fractured their sanity even as it illuminated it. This was not a lake. This was the artifact. Or rather, the lake was a manifestation, a window, a single, frozen tear in the fabric of what they had always assumed was reality. The patterns beneath the ice were the truth, the raw, unfiltered architecture of existence before human perception had imposed its flimsy order. The entity was not in the ice, it was the ice. And Blake, standing on its surface, holding a piece of its fundamental being, was not merely observing it. They were becoming it. A tremor ran through the frozen lake, not a physical quake, but a ripple of pure understanding that resonated through Blake's mind. The individual Blake blurred, stretched, became porous. Blake felt their consciousness expand, encompassing the frigid air, the silent expanse of the ice, the distant, bruised sky. They were no longer merely Blake, the archivist. They were a point of awareness on an infinite surface, a single, fragile thought within an incomprehensible, ancient mind. The artifact in their hand pulsed faster, its blackness deepening, becoming less an object and more a focal point for the overwhelming presence. It was pulling them, not physically, but spiritually, drawing their essence into the crystalline lattice of the frozen lake. Blake felt their memories begin to unspool, not as a loss, but as a reintegration, a return to a vast, collective memory that spanned epochs. Blake felt a final, agonizing clarity, a horrifying epiphany that was both utterly terrifying and profoundly peaceful. There was no escape because there was nowhere to escape to. Reality was a dream, and they were waking into the true, boundless, indifferent cosmos. Their individual consciousness was a fleeting ripple on an ocean of primordial thought. The cosmic horror was not an external threat, it was the fundamental nature of everything, and Blake was merely being returned to its embrace. Their vision blurred, not with tears, but with an overwhelming influx of non-information, a sensory overload of pure, undifferentiated existence. The distinction between their body and the frozen lake dissolved. The patterns beneath the ice no longer seemed distant, they were etched onto the inside of Blake's skull, the blueprints of an impossible architecture. A final, silent gasp escaped Blake's lips, not of pain, but of ultimate, terrifying comprehension. Then, their form, once distinct against the white expanse, seemed to waver, to shimmer at the edges. The cold wind continued its relentless sweep across the frozen lake, stirring nothing but the fine dust of ice. And somewhere, deep within its frozen heart, a new, infinitesimal flicker of awareness had been absorbed, adding its brief, human echo to the eternal, silent hum.